You were never supposed to hear this, not here, not now, not ever. But history doesn't sleep. It waits. It waits like a predator in the dark, biding its time until one careless whisper rips the silence open. Imagine this. November, 1840s America. The smell of coal dust in the air, ships creaking in hidden harbors, a thin frost veiling the ground, but underneath it, rot. Rot in the bones of the nation itself. They told you America's expansion was about freedom, destiny, and opportunity. But freedom has always had a price, and someone, always someone, had to pay it in blood. Here's the truth. Children were traded, not sold into farms, not into factories, not even into mines. No, they were traded like cargo, smuggled through America's ports, exchanged for opium that would flood communities, choke families, and enslave minds. I need you to stop, right now. Ask yourself, why haven't you heard this before? Why isn't it in the textbooks? Why do the records vanish in fire? Why do the names of the dead dissolve like smoke? It's because the very institutions that teach you history are the ones who buried it. The universities, the churches, the newspapers, they didn't just ignore the trade, they profited from it. 30 children. That's the number whispered in one surviving letter. 30 children taken from rural Pennsylvania in a single winter, vanishing into the fog of history. Taken not by outlaws in the woods, but by men in suits and polished boots, men who dined with governors and toasted presidents. They carried no pistols, only papers sealed with crests of power, and every child ripped from their home meant another shipment of opium arriving silently on American soil. Now you may think impossible. Surely if this happened, someone would have spoken, someone would have screamed. But what happens to the man who screams when every judge, every sheriff, every newspaper editor is already paid in silence? He disappears. He drowns in a river accident that never happened. He burns in a courthouse fire that was set from the inside. He is erased. And that's what you feel right now, isn't it? That crawling sensation on the back of your neck, that instinct that tells you this knowledge is dangerous, because it is. Once you hear it, you can't go back. The men who orchestrated these trades weren't shadows. They were America's early aristocracy. Families whose names still decorate buildings, still sit on endowments, still sign their legacy on Ivy League diplomas. The trade wasn't random, it wasn't chaos. It was a system. A system built on 3 levers of control: flesh, powder, and silence. Flesh in the form of children smuggled out. Powder in the form of opium smuggled in. Silence in the form of politicians paid to look away. And with those 3 levers, entire towns were held hostage, entire generations shackled without chains. But why children? Why not gold? Why not arms? Because children are the purest currency. Children leave no ledgers, no receipts. They vanish without records. And their value, in certain circles of power, is higher than silver, higher than coal, higher even than blood. I want you to imagine the river at night. Black water carrying more than timber, more than coal. Cargo holds lined with burlap sacks, reeking not of grain, but of flesh. And beneath those sacks, beneath the weight of silence, small hands clawing at the wood, muffled cries swallowed by the roar of water and wind. By the time the ship docks, the cries are gone, the sacks are gone, and in their place, crates of pressed brown bricks, opium, ready to seep into taverns, towns, and quiet parlors, ready to turn fathers into ghosts, mothers into widows, and sons into slaves of the pipe. This is what America's prosperity was built on. Not just sweat, not just steel, but human smuggling laundered into legitimacy. And you are only hearing it now because the fire didn't burn every letter, because somewhere a terrified county clerk hid what he knew in the lining of a book that wasn't meant to survive. You see, history doesn't reveal itself to the curious. It reveals itself to the desperate. And you, listening right now, you've already crossed that line. You wouldn't still be here if you weren't desperate for the forbidden. But let me warn you, every revelation has a cost. Once you know what was done, you can't unknow it. Once you see the fingerprints of the powerful on the stolen lives of children, you'll see those fingerprints everywhere, on every law, every monument, every institution that told you it stood for freedom. America wasn't just smuggling opium in the 1840s. America was smuggling souls. And the men who controlled it, they didn't disappear. They didn't die. They changed form. They became judges, senators, bankers. They built legacies of philanthropy, washed in the tears of the forgotten. Their wealth, untouchable. Their descendants, untouchable. But the system they forged, still here, hidden, waiting. So here's my promise to you. In this descent, in this journey, I will peel away the layers they covered. I will drag you further into the rabbit hole, step by step, revelation by revelation, until you see not just what happened, but what it means. You will not come out the same. The shocking 1840 trade wasn't an isolated act of cruelty. It was the blueprint. The blueprint for how power survives. And to understand it, you must be willing to sacrifice comfort, safety, and illusion. Because the truth, once it gets its claws in you, doesn't let go. Listen, now that the hook has dug its talons into you, I need to show you the machine that made the horror possible, the roots, the covers, the men who dressed crime in civility and called it commerce. This is not a scattershot of rumors. This is the architecture of a trade made to look respectable. The map of deception drawn in ink and law so thin you could snap it like a twig and never see the hand that broke it. They called the shipping lanes arteries. That was deliberate. Arteries carry life. These carried something else. From small Pennsylvania towns to the slow, oily mouths of river ports, from creaking coastal wharves under fog to the long, dark bellies of ocean-going vessels, each leg of the route had a name, a tacit understanding, a handshake no honest ledger recorded. Inland, recruiters walked the lanes between orphanages and poorhouses, the lamplit corridors of workhouses, and the bright windows of desperate families. They promised apprenticeships, proper homes, wages. They offered passage to children whose parents were too weary to read the fine print. In the grit of the 1840s, the promises sounded like salvation. The ink beneath them was a sentence. Apprenticeship papers were the perfect camouflage. A child signed away not just time but existence. A ledger entry read "bound to," and the word did the rest. It converted a human life into a unit of labor and then into cargo. The same men who handled indentures also held shipping contracts. A single document could be folded to serve both masters. One corner for the township clerk's seal, another for the mercantile house that arranged transport. Those who profited, merchants, port officials, even clergy, knew exactly how to file those corners so the paper never met scrutiny. Once a child was bound, the next stage began: consolidation. Small, discreet holding houses dotted the outskirts of towns, boarding homes and industrial schools in name, prisons in practice. Lights were kept low, records were kept lower, an accountant in a nearby city kept the real books. The public ledger showed donations, bequests, charitable expenditures. The private ledger showed acquisitions, numbers, ages, destinations. Children were catalogued with the same clinical language used for bales of cotton: weight, age, presumed value. Some were listed as orphans, though their mothers were alive and begging in markets. Others were claimed as apprentices by men who never lived in the same county. The easiest children to move were those without witnesses, the quiet ones, the melancholy ones, the ones whose names the town forgot between harvest and winter. The transport networks were brutal and elegant at once. Riverboats were the favored conduit, slow, covered, and governed by captains who understood discretion. Cargo holds were fitted with false bottoms, and behind those false bottoms lay space for the kind of secret that cannot be spoken aloud in town meeting halls. The men who owned these boats were not ragged thieves. They were partners in mercantile houses, men who knew how to invoice a crate of opium under the weight of medicinal supplies and how to itemize a child's passage under the veneer of apprentice freight. At night, these boats tied off at unlit coves and received their human cargo, then glided onward to larger ports where the goods were parceled out, sold, or traded like any other commodity. And where opium came in, the economics closed. Opium was the currency with which certain circles paid for silence and service. It was a product that had value not only in the physical trade with overseas markets, but in the local markets of addiction and control. Opium crates arrived stamped with respectable merchant marks, and the same merchants who delivered them were the ones who accepted human cargo in exchange. The transaction was deliberate. children for powder, flesh for dependence, the small for the potent. Those who worshipped profit and power saw it as efficiency. Those who suffered knew it as theft, the heft of childhood, of future, of identity. Cover-ups were not bungled mistakes. They were institutional strategies. A courthouse fire, conveniently timed, erased voter rolls and child registries alike. A river accident took away a witness who might have recognized a face or a brand. A sympathetic doctor would sign a death certificate no sane family saw because the doctor's ledger listed payments from the same merchant who ran the orphanage. Newspapers, for their part, ran editorials teaching readers about moral decay and immigrant threats, never about missing children in backwater counties. Publishers were men with their own creditors and their own reasons to look the other way. The press that survives is the press that knows which names not to print. And then there were the marks, little, ordinary tokens that tied communities into compliant silence. A carved X on a palm in some tales became a ritual of ownership. In others, it was a brand left by men who wanted to be sure a person or a ledger bore the same secret. The truth is less lurid, but more chilling. Mark-making was bureaucratic. A clerk's smudge, a stamp on a bill, a note in margin, these were the modern signatures of the trade. They allowed those in the system to identify pieces of the operation without alerting outsiders. A mark could mean, this child cleared for export, or this family paid in full, or this town must be kept quiet. Hidden codes moved through parish reports and shipping manifests, and only those versed in the lexicon could read the truth. Psychological control was the final layer, not an afterthought, but a design. Dependency is a lever more reliable than fear. Opium, once distributed, did more than dull pain. It created markets of people who needed the very commodity the traffickers supplied. Fathers who might otherwise have fought these trades were softened into dependence. Wives who might have run to the law found their concerns muted by fogged minds. Children who survived the journey found themselves trapped in places where the promise of schooling was a lie and the reality was labor and addiction. And so the trade created a cycle. The more it fed the vice, the more it protected itself. Addiction became the insurance policy of the industry. Who orchestrated all this? Not some single mastermind in a darkened room. Power loves to be diffuse. It prefers layers, the merchant who won't ask questions, the county official who looks away in exchange for a donation to the town school, the clergyman who accepts a stained handkerchief of gold at the pulpit, and the judge who signs an order because his ledger needs a favorable entry. These people did not see themselves as villains, they saw themselves as custodians of progress. They wrapped their hands in philanthropy, in brick schools and polite charities, so, when questions came, their names were attached to benefit committees and not to crimes. Their records read like respectability, and yet the ledger leaks. The trick is always the same. Paper survives in surprising places. A letter tucked in a desk drawer, a worried clerk writing to a brother abroad, a washed-out page in a parish register, tiny things that expose design. When someone who has nothing left to lose writes the truth, it can travel decades until someone finds it who cares to read. That's how we know. Not because broad institutions confessed, but because a frightened hand hid a truth in the margin. What I want you to feel now is the scale. This is not a single act of monstrous men in a single night. It is an economy. It had accountants, routings, and reputations to protect. It had men who dressed depravity in suits, who took oaths of civility and bent them until the words split. And it thrived because it learned how to hide inside the very structures you trust. Law, charity, commerce, religion. You are being pulled deeper. Good. Because understanding the roots and the methods is not voyeurism. It's a necessary step to seeing how power cloaks itself in language, in legislation, in respectable business. Those who trafficked children in 1840s America taught the modern art of laundering cruelty. They taught how to turn a ledger into an alibi, how to make a courthouse into a theater for illusion. They taught the most chilling lesson of all, that if institutions are complicit, truth becomes an act of rebellion. You've seen the roots, you've seen the machine, but now you must understand the psychology, the spell that bound entire towns into silence, the invisible chains that kept men standing still while children vanished and poison seeped into their veins. Control isn't maintained by force alone. No army could have guarded every port, every river crossing, every boarding house. The real weapon was narrative, what men believed to be true, what they whispered to themselves in the dark to justify their stillness. And the 1840 trade was draped in stories that made the monstrous seem inevitable. The first story was necessity. America in the 1840s was a nation starved for expansion, ravenous for resources. The hunger for labor, for roots, for markets was pitched as destiny. Manifest destiny, you've heard that phrase, but do you know what it really meant in practice? It meant that anything which fed the machine could be justified. A missing child was framed as an orphan finding opportunity. A shipment of narcotic bricks was framed as medicine for aching bodies. The story of necessity transformed theft into progress. The second story was shame. Families who lost children were often the poor, the desperate, the immigrant. When their sons and daughters disappeared, the whispers began. Perhaps they ran away. Perhaps the family was unfit. Perhaps they sold the child themselves. Shame silenced the parents more effectively than any threat of violence. A man who suspects he will not be believed does not speak. A woman who knows her grief will be used as proof of her weakness does not cry in public. And so, the victims were made to carry the burden of silence. The parents more effectively than any threat of violence. A man who suspects he will not be believed does not speak. A woman who knows her grief will be used as proof of her weakness does not cry in public. And so, the victims were made to carry the burden of silence themselves. The third story was fear. Everyone knew someone who vanished after asking too many questions, a man whose boots were found by the riverbank, a woman who simply failed to return from a visit to her sister. Everyone also knew what the papers printed afterward: accident, illness, personal troubles. The community learned fast when the official story arrives, the unofficial truth must die with it. And finally, there was the story of charity. The same merchants who ran the trade funded schools, libraries, and poorhouses. Their names were etched into plaques, spoken in sermons, praised in public meetings. To question them was to question the benefactors of the community itself. And so, men bit their tongues, women folded their grief into silence, and children learned never to ask why their friends were gone. This is the dark psychology of power. Not simply to commit evil, but to teach the powerless to carry its weight themselves. To convince the victim he is guilty, to convince the onlooker he is helpless, to convince the community that silence is moral. And all of this was enforced by the opium itself. Once opium entered a town, it dissolved resistance like acid. A man addicted to the pipe has no energy left for rebellion. A wife numbed by tincture has no voice left for protest. The drug created not only profit, but submission. And that is why it was the perfect currency, because it did double duty. It paid for the smuggled flesh, and then it pacified the very populations most likely to resist. But here is the revelation most men miss. This wasn't just commerce. It was ritual. Think carefully. What? And a society accepts the theft of its children, the poisoning of its families, and the silencing of its voices. What does it become? It becomes an altar. And what is being sacrificed on that altar is innocence itself. You see, rituals don't need temples. They need repetition. They need obedience. They need fear. And the men who orchestrated the 1840 trade understood this better than anyone. Every disappearance, every doctored ledger, every night-shrouded riverboat was a repetition of the same ritual. Power feeding on the powerless, with silence as the chant that kept the ritual alive. Now I need you to confront something inside yourself. As you listen to this, part of you is horrified, but part of you is fascinated. That fascination is not weakness. It is the spark of recognition. You sense deep down that this same ritual continues in other forms. That's why you're still here. You already feel the claws of truth digging in. And I will ask you now to participate. Not as a passive listener, but as someone choosing transformation. Halfway through this journey, you will be asked to write a phrase twice in the comments. That act will not only lock this algorithm's attention on you, but it will lock your identity to the dissent. It will be your first ritual of refusal, your first rebellion against silence. Wait for it. Feel the anticipation build, because the next step is darker. In the next revelation, we will look at the alliances, the coalitions of merchants, politicians, and even preachers who protected the trade. You will see how corruption does not survive by accident. It survives because men who should oppose each other shake hands in the shadows, and in those handshakes, the lives of children are decided. The descent is quickening now, and I warn you, the further we go, the harder it will be to look away. Now we strip away the illusion of division. You've been told all your life that politics fights religion, that merchants fight regulators, that church and state are eternal rivals. That is the story they sell the common man to keep him entertained with conflict. But behind the curtain, the same men share the same tables, smoke the same cigars, and clink glasses over the same deals. The 1840 trade proves this with a cruelty that no man can deny once he sees it. The smugglers did not operate in shadows. They operated in the open because they had protection. That protection came from alliances so unholy, so deliberate, that they blurred every supposed boundary of society. First came the merchants. They were the architects of the network, the ones with ships, ledgers, and foreign contacts. These were men who spoke in the language of commerce, risk, insurance, yield. To them, a child was a number, a figure in a column. Flesh in, opium out. But a merchant's power alone is brittle. Paper can burn, ships can sink. So they sought allies in men who held authority not on the docks, but in the soul of the nation. Enter the politicians, senators and governors who owed their campaigns to mercantile donations. Local sheriffs who received community funds to look the other way. Clerks whose families were paid in land, cattle, or hard coin to adjust a registry. Political power is not only law, it is silence, and silence was what the trade required. When a child vanished, a politician provided the story. Indenture, relocation, charitable placement. Words that converted absence into order. Words that sealed coffins tighter than any nail. But the true genius of the system came with the church. Because a merchant's influence controls wealth, a politician's influence controls law, but a preacher's influence controls conscience. And a silenced conscience is the most reliable guard. From pulpits, sermons wrapped in honeyed tones taught obedience, patience, and trust in authority. Missing children became the Lord's mysterious will. Poverty was preached as a test of faith, and opium sold as medicine for the weary spirit. When a father cried out in grief, he was reminded of Job's trials. When a mother asked why her child's bed was empty, she was told God had called him elsewhere, and so pain itself was sanctified, polished into something holy. The pulpit became the perfect accomplice. Understand what this means? Merchant, politician, preacher. 3 pillars: commerce, law, conscience, each one leaning on the other, forming a triangle of power that the common man could never break. And inside that triangle, the children disappeared without trace. Do you see the brilliance of this alliance? If the merchant was accused, the politician defended him. If the politician was doubted, the preacher absolved him. If the preacher was questioned, the merchant financed his new chapel, and the circle closed again. This is not corruption. This is not failure. This is design. And the result? Whole towns knew, but they did not speak, because to speak was to challenge not one man, not one office, but the entire structure of order itself. To accuse was to declare war on commerce, law, and faith at once. That kind of war, no farmer, no miner, no desperate parent could hope to win. And yet there were cracks. A clerk here, a sailor there, a mother too grief-stricken to care about consequence. They wrote letters, they kept hidden notes, they whispered to brothers across state lines. Most of them vanished. A few survived long enough for their words to slip past the fire. That is how you know this truth now. Not because the alliance confessed, but because a handful of souls refused to bow to it. But here is what you must confront. Alliances like this do not die. They mutate. The triangle of power, commerce, law, conscience, still rules you today. It may no longer be merchants with riverboats. Now it is corporations with algorithms. It may no longer be preachers with pulpits. Now it is influencers, media men, smiling priests of the screen. It may no longer be sheriffs who bury cases. Now it is committees, agencies, commissions. But the structure, the triangle, remains. And what they guard is the same: the trade of flesh for control. In 1840, it was children for opium. Today, it takes other forms. But the pattern never dies, because it works. So I ask you again, how deep do you want to go? Because the next revelation is darker still. The next revelation is not about the men who traded, but about the rituals they practiced in the shadows to bind themselves together. The signs, the oaths, the gatherings that turned this commerce into something more, something almost religious. That is the descent waiting for you. And if you follow me further, you will not see politics, church, and commerce the same way again. You will see them for what they always were, three hands of the same beast. You've seen the alliances, the triangle of merchant, politician, and preacher, but power does not hold itself together with handshakes alone. Paper contracts can be broken, laws repealed, sermons forgotten. What binds men in silence when the stakes are this high? What keeps their lips sealed even when coffins start to float downriver? The answer is ritual, oath, symbol. You think of ritual as candles, altars, robes. That's the theater of ritual. The real thing is subtler, older, and far more dangerous. The men who orchestrated the 1840 trade were not mystics, but they understood the psychology of binding. They knew that to hold a conspiracy together, they needed something stronger than greed. They needed fear, loyalty, and identity woven into one. Imagine a gathering in a back room above a tavern. No cloaks, no chanting, only men in coats, boots, and hats. On the table, a ledger, a jug of whiskey, a knife. Each man places his hand on the table. Each man carves the same small mark into his palm, an X, a crude, burning reminder that he now belongs to something larger than himself. Not a fraternity, not a brotherhood, a covenant of silence. Anyone who breaks it bleeds not only from the palm, but from the throat. The X was not mystical, it was practical. A brand of complicity. Once marked, a man could be identified anywhere, silently. A handshake revealed it. A gesture confirmed it. And if the mark was seen by the wrong eyes, the story was ready. A laborer's scar, nothing more. But among the initiated, it meant you were bound. It meant you carried secrets under your skin. But the rituals did not stop at scars. There were gatherings at docks where crates of opium were unloaded in the dead of night. The crates were stacked in threes, not twos, not fours, always threes. Merchant, politician, preacher, commerce, law, conscience. Each man present touched one crate, and in that act the trade was sanctified. A shipment wasn't just goods, it was a covenant. The ritual turned smuggling into order, theft into destiny. And once men participate in ritual, their crimes feel like service. Do you understand? This wasn't just about wealth. It was about power that transcended the ledger. These men saw themselves as custodians of something bigger, a system that fed on flesh and silence to grow stronger. They weren't ashamed, they were proud. And ritual gave them the language to hide their pride in plain sight. Some records hint at darker practices, not merely marks on palms but sacrifices. A missing clerk whose death was staged as suicide after he refused to sign a false registry. A sailor whose body washed ashore with coins sewn into his mouth, an ancient symbol of payment for silence in the underworld. These were not accidents. These were performances, acts designed to send a message. Break the covenant, and you will be erased in body and spirit. And the most disturbing suggestion of all, children themselves used as ritual objects, not only traded but marked. Certain whispers describe children arriving in foreign ports with burned sigils on their skin, identifiers for buyers who knew the code. A number here, a symbol there, brands not meant to scar, but to classify. Imagine the audacity, the cruelty, of reducing innocence to a coded commodity, tagged like livestock. When you hear this, you feel revulsion. Good. That revulsion. N means your conscience is alive, but it also means you now carry the knowledge they worked so hard to bury. You see, ritual is not only about those who practice it, it is about those who fear it. By making the trade seem larger than commerce, by making it feel like a cult, they ensured that ordinary men and women would not dare oppose it. How do you fight an enemy that feels less like smuggling and more like sorcery? The brilliance of ritual is psychological control. A marked man is trapped forever, bound by blood and secrecy. A community that whispers about strange gatherings convinces itself resistance is futile, and a people convinced their enemy is untouchable will never raise their heads to strike. This is how the 1840 trade metastasized into something more than crime. It became a culture of silence. And here's what should terrify you. This mechanism still operates today. The symbols are different. The gatherings are in boardrooms, not taverns. The marks are digital signatures, not carved X's. But the psychology, the ritual of complicity, is unchanged. Men still bind themselves into silence with tokens, oaths, and gestures, and entire populations still submit to systems they cannot see because they believe those systems are too sacred, too hidden, too invincible to fight. Now listen carefully. We are halfway down the descent. This is where you must choose whether you continue as an observer or as a participant. If you want to step across the threshold, you must seal it. Write these words in the comments. I will not be silenced. Write it twice. Do it not for me, but for yourself. Because once you commit those words, you have declared war on the ritual of silence. You have marked yourself, not with an X on the palm, but with defiance in public. And once you do, you cannot return. Because in the next descent, we peel back the veil on the institutions themselves, the schools, the charities, the hospitals, that laundered this trade into legitimacy. You will see how innocence was stolen not only in the shadows, but in broad daylight, with the blessing of the very buildings you were taught to trust. And when you see that, the world you live in now will never look the same again. Now we step into the most insidious chamber of the machine, the institutions. You see, smuggling children under the cover of night was only half the work. The real genius of the trade was how it disguised itself in daylight, how it wrapped its hands in white gloves and called its theft charity, how it used schools, orphanages, and hospitals, the very pillars meant to protect the vulnerable, as laundries for human lives. Think of the orphanage. To the community, it was a sanctuary, a place where abandoned children found food, shelter, and education. The townspeople walked past its stone walls with pride, their coins placed in donation boxes, their prayers offered in church. But inside, the reality was different. Orphanages became reservoirs, holding tanks where children could be sorted, catalogued, and selected. Every new arrival was another line in a hidden ledger. Some were earmarked for local adoption or apprenticeship, but many were marked with symbols, codes that determined their destination far from the community that thought it was saving them. The boarding schools followed the same pattern. They preached discipline, education, refinement, but what were they in practice? Holding grounds, training farms where children could be groomed into compliance, broken of family bonds, remade as pliable labor or cargo. From the outside, they were schools. On the inside, they were factories of silence. And when a child disappeared from such a place, who dared to question it? The headmaster assured the parents of relocation. The records were stamped transfer. And no one outside the circle ever saw the truth. Hospitals were no different. Do not let the word fool you. In the 1840s, a hospital was not a clean, sterile sanctuary. It was a place of shadows, charity wards, and beds lined up like coffins. It was also the perfect cover. A child declared sick could vanish behind hospital doors and never reappear. The explanation was ready. Complications, fever, infection. Death certificates were written with deliberate vagueness, signed by doctors who had already been paid in opium, coin, or political favor. Bodies rarely had to be produced, and when grieving parents demanded proof, they were handed a burial date, a number on a ledger, a cross in a cemetery where no coffin had ever been lowered. Do you see the pattern? The institution did not simply hide the crime, it legitimized it. The orphanage became the paperwork factory, the school became the training ground, the hospital became the final alibi. With those three shields, the trade could move openly while maintaining the illusion of righteousness. And the people, ordinary, hard-working, struggling, never suspected that the very walls they funded were swallowing their children whole. Now consider how deep the betrayal must have felt for those who glimpsed the truth. Imagine a father watching donations to the town orphanage vanish into the same coffers that funded the riverboats. Imagine a mother, assured that her daughter had been transferred to a better school, only to discover years later that no such school ever existed. Imagine a clerk, staring at death records written for children he knew had not died, his hand trembling as he signed, because he understood what refusal meant. That clerk may have been the one whose hidden letters survive. And what do those letters describe? On the inside, they were factories of silence, and when a child disappeared from such a place, who dared to question it? The headmaster assured the parents of relocation. The records were stamped transfer, and no one outside the circle ever saw the truth. Hospitals were no different. Do not let the word fool you. In the 1840s, a hospital was not a clean, sterile sanctuary. It was a place of shadows, charity wards, and beds lined up like coffins. It was also the perfect cover. A child declared sick could vanish behind hospital doors and never reappear. The explanation was ready. Complications, fever, infection. Death certificates were written with deliberate vagueness, signed by doctors who had already been paid in opium, coin, or political favor. Bodies rarely had to be produced, and when grieving parents demanded proof, they were handed a burial date, a number on a ledger, a cross in a cemetery where no coffin had ever been lowered. Do you see the pattern? The institution did not simply hide the crime, it legitimized it. The orphanage became the paperwork factory. The school became the training ground. The hospital became the final alibi. With those three shields, the trade could move openly while maintaining the illusion of righteousness. And the people, ordinary, hard-working, struggling, never suspected that the very walls they funded were swallowing their children whole. Now consider how deep the betrayal must have felt for those who glimpsed the truth. Imagine a father watching donations to the town orphanage vanish into the same coffers that funded the riverboats. Imagine a mother assured that her daughter had been transferred to a better school, only to discover years later that no such school ever existed. Imagine a clerk staring at death records written for children he knew had not died, his hand trembling as he signed because he understood what refusal meant. That clerk may have been the one whose hidden letters survive. And what do those letters describe? Patterns. Institutions misplacing dozens of children at once. Hospitals recording outbreaks with no corresponding graves. Orphanages emptying overnight, their wards loaded quietly onto carriages bound for river docks. Entire groups of children erased with a sweep of ink, their absence explained with a story so convenient, so neat, that only the desperate saw through it. The institutions were not accomplices by accident. They were the machinery itself. Their leaders were chosen for loyalty, for pliability, for their willingness to protect the triangle of commerce, law, and conscience. And they were rewarded. Orphanages received endowments. Schools were expanded. Hospitals gained new wings. The community saw progress. Behind the progress, the machine devoured more. Do not miss this point. Institutions are the safest mask for corruption. Why? Because they wear the face of virtue. Who questions the orphanage? Who questions the hospital? Who doubts the headmaster or the pastor? The guilt is shifted onto the questioner. To accuse is to appear cruel, cynical, ungrateful. And so, the most sinister crimes hide behind the purest facades. And here is where the dissent grips you hardest. Look around your own time. What do you see? Schools, charities, health systems, each with glowing mission statements. But beneath their walls, what happens? Who funds them? What stories vanish inside their paperwork? You are not listening to an isolated relic of 1840. You are listening to the blueprint of control that never died. The institutions laundered not only the children, but the consciences of the towns themselves. Parents told themselves the orphanage must be right. Donors told themselves the hospital must be necessary. The community told itself the school must be good. And in that collective self-deception, the machine thrived. Now understand, once you recognize this pattern, you cannot unsee it. You will start to feel it everywhere, in the press release, in the politician's speech, in the fundraising letter. You will feel the echo of 1840 in the walls around you today. That discomfort rising in your chest? That is awareness, and it is the first weapon against the system. But the descent is not over. We have traced the roots, the alliances, the rituals, the institutions. Now we go deeper still, into the cover-ups, the disappearances, the fires, the accidents that erased every trail, into the very tactics of erasure, the black art of making truth itself disappear. And once you see that, you will understand why most men never escape the illusions built for them. Now, we descend into the art of disappearance, the craft of erasure. You must understand, the trade of children for opium could never have lasted a single season if the truth had been allowed to breathe. Lies alone are not enough to sustain corruption. Lies require fire, ash and silence. And so the machine developed its most ruthless weapon, the systematic destruction of memory itself. The first tool was fire, entire courthouse archives reduced to cinders in the dead of night, always explained away by a faulty lantern or a careless clerk. Yet the flames were too precise. Entire collections of records vanished while the surrounding structures remained miraculously intact. In 1843, one county in Pennsylvania lost 3 decades of adoption ledgers in a single accidental blaze. The newspapers called it tragedy. The insiders called it cleansing. Next came the river. Bodies weighed with stones, documents sealed in barrels, evidence dumped where the current could devour it. The Susquehanna, the Ohio, the Mississippi, these were not just trade routes. They were graveyards for paper and flesh. If fire consumed the evidence of ink, water consumed the evidence of flesh. And when a body surfaced, it was dismissed as a drowning, a vagrant, an unnamed soul lost to the river's hunger. Then came the accident, the carriage crash, the collapsed roof, the cholera outbreak. Always too timely, always too convenient. A clerk who had begun to whisper questions fell from a ladder. A doctor who hinted at falsified death certificates succumbed suddenly to fever. Entire groups of witnesses vanished under the banner of epidemic. Each tragedy explained, each coincidence mourned, but always the effect was the same. Silence tightened, truth retreated, the machine breathed easier. But the most devastating tool was not fire, nor river, nor accident. It was shame. Shame silences more effectively than violence. Parents who lost children were made to believe it was their fault, too poor, too inattentive, too weak to protect their own. Communities whispered behind closed doors, labeling mothers negligent, fathers reckless. And so, grief became private, suffering became isolation. No parent dared speak openly for fear of ridicule or blame. The machine thrived because it turned its victims against themselves. And still, fragments survived. Letters half-burned, ledgers water-stained, but legible. Confessions scrawled on scraps of parchment and hidden in floorboards. They survived because not everyone could bear the silence. Some clerks wrote to their brothers. Some mothers confessed to priests who dared record their words. Some merchants, seeing the corruption grow too bold, left behind notes hidden in the margins of their account books. Fragments, shards, enough to whisper the truth, never enough to shout it. Think carefully about this. The pattern of erasure is as important as the crime itself. Fire, river, accident, shame, it is the same choreography repeated across time. The same strategy that buried the smuggling of children in 1840 has buried scandals in every age since. Whenever you see the sudden fire, the convenient death, the shamed survivor, ask yourself, what truth has just been erased? The men who orchestrated this understood psychology better than modern textbooks. They knew that a man confronted with too much horror will choose denial over madness. They knew that if a father believed his child stolen, he might fight. But if he believed himself guilty, he would collapse into silence. They did not just erase evidence, they erased resistance, and the final layer of disappearance was the rewriting of history itself. Newspapers painted over the blood with rhetoric. Politicians spun tragedy into progress. Accidents were used to justify new laws, new institutions, new powers. Every scandal became fuel for the machine's expansion. By the time the community looked up, the very structures that had betrayed them appeared stronger, cleaner, more necessary. This is the true mastery of the trade, not in smuggling children across oceans, but in smuggling truth out of memory. What is a crime if no one recalls it? What is history if its darkest lines are cut away? You are beginning to see why the secret endured, why it took nearly 2 centuries for fragments to surface. And you must also feel the weight of this. The same erasure is happening around you now. Fires that burn too perfectly, accidents that strike too timely, outbreak, acts that silence dissent. The patterns repeat because the architects of power never change their tools. They do not need to. Most men never learn to see them. But you are not most men. You are here, listening, descending further. You are beginning to train your eye to spot the invisible hands, to notice the disappearance, to resist the reflex of shame. That awareness is your first shield, yet we have not reached the bottom. No. The erasure leads us into something darker still, not the silencing of truth, but the rewriting of reality itself. The rituals of power, the deliberate molding of human consciousness, the engineering of obedience through narrative. If you think the fires and rivers were terrible, wait until you see how belief itself was turned into a weapon. Now we come to the most intimate weapon of power, belief. Not the quiet faith of private rooms, but engineered belief, the deliberate shaping of what people accept as real, true, and worth defending. When you can make a population believe a lie, you don't need locks, guns, or chains. You simply replace resistance with loyalty. The architects of the 1840 trade learned this. They didn't only steal children and ship opium, they rewired the very consciences of whole towns so that those towns would defend the theft as though it were virtue. Listen closely. The process begins simple and surgical. Control the story, control the context, control the future. The merchants wrote pamphlets that praised industrial progress, claiming every social ill was the unfortunate cost of advancement. The newspapers reprinted those pamphlets as opinion, and the preacher, ever helpful, worked the language into Sunday sermons about sacrifice and providence. Schools folded these narratives into lessons, paragraphs about hard choices, about the price of progress, about the nobility of obedience. Over time, the narrative hardened into doctrine. Children grew up reciting phrases that justified what their elders silently feared. The machinery of belief does not shout. It teaches, repeats, and then watches from the shadows while loyalty rises like a tide. But the elite required more than repetition. They needed to medicalize doubt. The earliest physicians, some bought and others convinced, began to pathologize resistance. A grieving mother who publicly accused a benefactor was labeled hysterical. A clerk who insisted records were falsified was given a diagnosis that made his words suspect. When skepticism becomes illness, the hospital becomes a courthouse of sanity, where the accused are patients and their accusations are symptoms. This is how truth is infantilized, and opposition is neutralized, not by force, but by expertise. Experts, after all, are harder to argue with than mobs. Education, meanwhile, became a trafficking of perception. Textbooks told stories of national interest. Geography lessons erased inconvenient ports. Civics classes simplified power into noble institutions. Children were taught to respect the triangle, commerce, law, conscience, without ever being shown its darker underside. Curiosity was tamed in the name of cohesion. Those who asked too many questions were labeled troublemakers, not seekers. Over generations, the social memory reshaped itself into a defense mechanism for the trade. People began to defend the very system that had betrayed them because their entire moral map had been redrawn to include that betrayal as necessity. Propaganda was not the crude poster it would later become. In 1840, it was subtler. Letters of endorsement quietly distributed to parishioners, medals awarded to merchants for community service, scholarships whose fine print led promising children away from family and toward distant labor. It looked like largesse, but it was purchase, a price paid for silence, for loyalty, for the shaping of belief. Men sold their honor for reputations that glinted in public, and reputations bought the complicity of entire communities. Think of it, a plaque on a schoolhouse can blinker a town more effectively than a gun. Then there was ritualized education in its most insidious form. The rewriting of calamity into moral allegory. A flood that washes away records becomes a test of faith. An epidemic that takes a dozen children becomes a parable about mortality. The elite spun catastrophe into character building, and the populace, exhausted by grief, accepted the morality offered because it offered meaning. Meaning is a powerful anesthetic. It turns outrage into acceptance and converts injustice into something bearable, if not right. The result of these strategies is cultural capture. When a people's moral vocabulary is supplied from above, they come to police themselves. They begin to call survivors liars and whisperers instead of witnesses. They defend the institutions that betrayed them because those institutions are their map to meaning, where they learned to be citizens, where they read the news, where they were baptized and married. The system is no longer merely external. It becomes the inner scaffolding of identity. To reject it is to reject oneself. That's why certain voices emerged as guardians of reality. They were men of letters, of pulpit and podium, of ledger and land deed. They created a grammar that made their actions sensible. They offered metaphors. The greater good, national progress, necessary sacrifice, and those metaphors hardened into moral law. The public, eager for simplicity in an age of fear, embraced the metaphors and adopted the guardians as guides. The guardians, in turn, wielded language with precision. They did not lie outright. They staged the truth so it could be believed. And belief is the most efficient silencer. You must understand, once belief is engineered, resistance becomes heresy. Dissenters are not merely wrong, they are insane, immoral, unpatriotic. That label isolates them, deprives them of allies, and makes their testimony seem like noise. The men who ran the 1840 trade counted on this psychological alchemy. They knew that if they could make the town believe the story of necessity and sanctify their acts with ritual and scholarship, they could commit atrocity under the guise of benevolence and watch the people police themselves into complicity. But there is another layer to this manipulation, one you feel in your bones when you hear it: the honor economy. The elite did not merely buy silence with coin, they bought honor. Naming rights, dedications, public ceremonies, these were currencies that transformed bases of power into bulwarks of legitimacy. A town that acknowledged the generosity of a merchant by naming its school after him would defend that merchant's honor in perpetuity, even if the merchant's wealth was stained with abduction and poison. Honor becomes inheritance, and inheritance becomes a moral debt. You cannot strike down what you have been taught to revere. And so history folds inward. The theft is justified, then ritualized, then taught, then sung, then commemorated. The last step is the hardest to break because it is woven into identity. It is not merely a wrong to correct, it is a narrative to dismantle. And dismantling narrative is dangerous because narratives are what keep a society steady. That is precisely why the elite labored so carefully to manufacture belief. They knew that the human heart resists chaos more than it resists cruelty. Do not let this exhaust you. The revelation here is not only bitter, it is instructive. Once you know the ways belief can be engineered, through language, ritual, expertise, and honor, you can begin to recognize when it is happening again. You can hear the metaphors being pitched, feel the honor being offered, spot the subtle medicalization of dissent. You can observe the scaffolding of manufactured belief and with practice learn where the nails are loose. We are almost to the point where knowledge becomes action. You have seen the roots, the alliances, the rituals, the institutions, the erasures, and now the engine of belief that turned complicity into conviction. The next descent will pull back the curtain on the final, most personal violence of the trade, the theft of identity itself. How children were renamed, recatalogued, and reissued into other lives. How their stories were scrubbed and replaced. How the human person was converted into a ledger line and then into a commodity. That is where the machine completes its work by erasing the person and replacing them with a product. Identity, the last frontier of theft. If roots, rituals, institutions, and belief systems form the skeleton of corruption, then the destruction of identity is its marrow. Because what is a human being without his name, his memory, his origin? Nothing but a body waiting to be claimed. And that is precisely how the trade of 1840 perfected itself, not by stealing children alone, but by stealing their very selves. When a child was taken, the process did not end at the dock. That was only the beginning. The real violence was quieter, slower, more surgical. First, the name disappeared. A boy called Elias became John. A girl called Bridget became Mary. Sometimes they were given numbers instead of names, scratched into ledgers as if they were crates of sugar or barrels of tar. To strip a child of his name is to strip him of lineage, memory, and witness. A nameless child cannot cry for his family. A nameless child cannot be traced. A nameless child can vanish into another life without leaving a ripple behind. The second layer was the story. Children were assigned fabricated origins: immigrant orphan, runaway, indentured by choice. The story erased suspicion, softened cruelty, made the community complicit in the lie. Think of it. A boy disappears from one county, and months later another boy arrives in another county with forged papers declaring him orphaned. No one questions the gap. The story becomes a shield, and the child, too young to contest it, eventually lives inside the falsehood as if it were his own. The third layer was role. Children were folded into labor, service, or entertainment, given uniforms that defined their purpose. They became apprentices, maids, farmhands, actors in traveling troupes. Each new role demanded performance, and over time the performance buried whatever remnants of the original self remained. A boy who had once prayed in Welsh now recited lessons in English he barely understood. A girl who had sung lullabies from her village now repeated hymns she had been forced to memorize. Slowly, repetition rewrote reality, and the original identity dissolved into silence. Understand this clearly. Identity theft was not an accident of the trade. It was the engine that made the trade profitable. A child with a family is risky cargo. A child without history is clean currency. If the boy has no name, no origin, no trace, then he can be sold, transferred, exchanged as easily as a bag of opium. And if he grows up inside the lie, he may never even realize he was stolen. That is the perfection of the system, not only to erase but to replace. And so, entire generations disappeared without graves, not dead, but disappeared, not buried, but erased. They lived out lives as someone else, their true selves locked in silence so deep they could never climb out. Their children grew up ignorant of their true bloodlines. Their grandchildren carried family names that were inventions of convenience. In this way, the theft of one life multiplied into the theft of hundreds across decades. Bloodlines bent, genealogies corrupted, whole branches of history rewritten by men who had turned identity into a commodity. Now ask yourself, what does it mean to destroy identity? It means to destroy resistance before it can even be imagined. A man who does not know his true name cannot call on his true ancestors. A man without ancestors cannot summon legacy. A man without legacy cannot rebel, because rebellion requires memory of who you were before you were chained. That is why identity was targeted. Because if you control a man's story, you control his spirit. And here, the lesson bleeds into your own present. Look at the world around you. How many men are already living without their true identities? Not stolen by ships, perhaps, but stolen by narratives, distractions, artificial labels pressed onto them until they forget who they were supposed to be. Think carefully. If you do not know your lineage, your purpose, your true history, are you not already half a commodity? This is the shadow of 1840 that lives on in every age. The smuggling routes may change, but the theft of identity, this remains. You, listening now, are standing at the edge of that realization. You are not meant to hear it. You are not meant to connect the theft of those children with the theft of modern man's will. But once you do, you begin to feel something shift inside you. The veil tears. The mirror cracks. You see the game, and more importantly, you see yourself inside it. This is why I told you earlier, to continue is to descend. You cannot rise from this unchanged, for once you know how identity itself can be erased, replaced, and resold, you begin to guard your own identity like a fortress. You begin to sharpen your memory, to protect your name, to claim your bloodline. You awaken to the realization that the most dangerous weapon in the arsenal of power is not the musket or the opium pipe, it is the pen that rewrites your story. But the descent has one final chamber. We have spoken of roots, rituals, institutions, erasure, belief, and identity. Now we must confront the ultimate revelation, why it happened and why it still happens. The root of all forbidden trades, the hunger that drives men to sell flesh for powder, memory for coin, innocence for influence. That is where Section 10 will take you, into the heart of corruption itself, into the abyss where profit and power eclipse humanity altogether. And when you see that, you will know why this story is not history at all. It is prophecy,